So got it. Okay, so you started recording. And we've got Michael Collins, Executive Director of the Americas Institute for Economics and Peace. Michael, you are there with us, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Wonderful. And we have Muzna Siddiqui. Please tell me, Muzna, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Yes? Okay. Former research consultant, both the Simpson Center's Global Governance, Justice, Security Program, and High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. And finally, Richard Ponzio, Dr. Richard Ponzio. So we have everyone there. That's great. There's going to be 2 rounds of questioning. I think you guys are aware of some of the constraints with time. I don't want you to worry too much about time. It's kind of my job to keep an eye on that. So just, just feel free to sort of say what's on your mind. And if you find that I have to interrupt at any point, don't be bothered by that. It's just to keep things running along. So yes, I might get in there and at some point with follow-up questions, or just to keep it as natural and spontaneous, just as though we were all in the same room, having a cup of coffee or something with each other. So yeah, roughly 2 rounds of questioning, and then we go for a bit of Q&A. Hopefully, I think we've got some questions already coming in, and people are going to be submitting their questions via the YouTube chat window. For those of them, I think everyone is watching on YouTube, right?
Yes.
It's just us on Zoom.
Put him has just joined us.
Okay, wonderful. I can't see her though. Where is she?
Wearing a reddish shirt.
Yeah, she's not, but she's not on my screen. Oh, hang on, do I have to move along? Okay, got you now. Hello, Poonam. Great, you're on mute, but I can see you. That's wonderful. So you're there. Excellent.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome.
Nice to see you, Poonam. You're just joining us. So let me tell you, let me just give you an idea of how it will work. I will moderate the session. We're going to get...
Do it in like 30 seconds because we should be going silent within a minute.
Yeah. So anyway, I think everyone is clear on what we're doing. Opening remarks from Lolwa and Brian, followed by panel discussion, 2 rounds of questions, and then a Q&A with the people that are watching. So yeah, wonderful to meet you all, and looking forward to it.
Thank you. Nidara, if you want to just mention, we're going to go straight into going silent and going live.
That's right. So we're just going to stay quiet for a minute, and then we'll start I think Maddie's going to play some background music for us, and then we'll go.
Are you going to give me a thumbs up on WhatsApp?
Yes, we will, Mariam. I'll message you as soon as we're ready to go. And just so everyone knows, this is being live streamed as well.
No, that's cool. I will just wait for your, obviously we're going to be silent, so I will just wait for got my WhatsApp in front of me, so.
Thank you so much. All right, so if we could all go quiet, and then Maddie, if you could share screen and play the music, we're ready to start.
Enjoy, everybody.
Okay, everyone. I think we are good to go. All right, well, hello, and a very warm welcome to you all, friends, colleagues from around the globe, wherever you happen to be joining us from, for this hybrid event. Of course, we got accustomed to doing things this way during the pandemic. Of course, it would be lovely to be with you all physically there, but I guess this is what technology is there for, to bridge the divide. And of course, we are here today to discuss the new report, Rethinking Global Cooperation, 3 New Frameworks for Collective Action in the Age of Uncertainty. My name is Mariam Namazi, and I am delighted to be with you all to moderate today's event. Thank you very much for inviting me. And of course, this comes after last week, the 77th session of the General Assembly in New York, with a focus on negotiations by UN member states on a declaration on future generations having a global digital impact and a new agenda for peace in the run-up to a heads of state summit of the future that is set to take place in September 2024. The findings and recommendations in the Rethinking Global Cooperation report couldn't be more timely in terms of really trying to focus those conversations on the future of global governance. Now, this report is sponsored by the Doha Forum, co-sponsored, I should say, by the Doha Forum and the Stimson Center. This is a collaboration now in its 4th year, and of course, it has been a very strange, interesting, tumultuous time, perhaps we can say. I work in a newsroom, and our flagship program really has a sort of a broad editorial sweep of global affairs. And I was fascinated to read many of the stories and the issues and the trends that we cover often in our program cited in this report. But more than that, beyond that, there were also practical, actionable measures described here for dealing with everything from the growing realities of climate change, arguably our greatest challenge, to threats to human rights, and perhaps now the risk of nuclear war, and also challenges that have spanned across time, like hunger, poverty, now exacerbated by the pandemic, and fresh outbreaks of war and conflict. But very important that the report also covers trends and dilemmas around technology and digital governance, and how it sort of interacts with some of those other issues I mentioned. I dare say that there is a note of optimism in this report as well, something that is in very short supply if you work in news. So I'm certainly looking forward to some inspiration today and some positivity from a fantastic lineup of guests and speakers that we have. We have a panel discussion coming up, and of course I hope to hear from many of you who are watching us now. We're going to start by hearing from Her Excellency Lolwa Al Khatir, Assistant Foreign Minister of the State of Qatar and Executive Director of the Doha Forum, as well as Brian Finlay, President and CEO of the Stimson Center. They're going to kick things off for us. We're going to start by hearing opening remarks from them, and then we will have a panel discussion with the speakers who've been good enough to join us today. Just a quick note to you all that for those of you who are viewing this event via the live stream on YouTube, please do send through your questions and comments. I know that questions are already coming in, which is great. Very important to be able to connect with each other, to share and exchange ideas. So it's very important that you participate and you interact with us. Want to hear from you. You just need to put in your comments. You don't have to wait till the end of the discussion. You can start sending through questions now. There is obviously a chat window in YouTube, but also if you're using Twitter, you can hashtag RGC launch on Twitter. Send through questions that way, but then also there is, I suppose, what is now the old-fashioned way. You can just send your questions through by email as well, by writing to ggin@stimson.org. And so when you do send your questions in, do also submit your name and your organizational affiliation as well. So with that, I will hand it over to Ms. Khater. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Namazi, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. In connection with the start of the UN General Assembly, the 77th session, which just took place a few days ago in New York, where I just came from, my Doha Forum colleagues and myself are pleased to participate in today's program to mark the public launch of Rethinking Global Cooperation, 3 new frameworks for collective action in an age of uncertainty. This report, with its detailed analysis and elaboration of newly recommended frameworks for future generations, digital cooperation and peace, represents the latest annual intellectual collaboration between Doha Forum and our colleagues at the Stimson Center. As with our previous collaborations since 2019, we hope this report will serve as an important resource for the Doha Forum community and the Stimson Center community and members of the Global Governance Innovation Network, as well as policymakers, researchers, advocates, and journalists. While multiple ongoing wars, climate change, and the COVID-19 pandemic continue to capture global headlines, the world has witnessed a jump of 150 million people affected by hunger since even before the pandemic, a disturbing trend arguably exacerbated by what we call the 3 Cs: conflict, changing climate, and COVID. Meanwhile, cyberspace tools are bringing unprecedented development opportunities to our hyper-connected world economy and have precipitated the need for a new framework to regulate interstate relations to prevent and manage conflicts across borders. Fortunately, the Summit of the Future, which will occur in September 2024 during the General Assembly's annual high-level week, will be a once-in-a-generation opportunity to review and dramatically improve tools for managing such numerous and complex problems worldwide. This intergovernmental process is expected to highlight the need for a more urgent and capable response by the world's governance system to the rising risk of nuclear war and the growing realities of runaway climate change, resurgent poverty, and the myriad threats to human rights in general. While the summit will not tackle the world's most colossal problems overnight, obviously, it represents a rare opportunity to achieve some high-profile wins in the hopefully near term. The global policy frameworks with the potential to focus and transform the summit's agenda are a declaration on future generations, a global digital compact, and a new agenda for peace. And let me briefly say a word about each policy framework. If we start with the first one, proclaiming the well-being of future generations as a global public good, a declaration on future generations could be crafted with consideration of, in particular, the legal rights and obligations toward future generations, providing legal recognition to the well-being of future generations obviously requires a duty of care made explicit to which member states can be held accountable. Globally, the connection between human well-being and our natural environment, human rights, was made ever clearer in the recent historic UN General Assembly resolution that declared access to a clean and healthy environment to be a universal human right. In addition, investing in future generations means investing in the youth and full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The cross-cutting sustainable development goals lay the foundation for thriving youth populations today and determine the opportunities they face as they grow into the adults of tomorrow. Such responsibilities towards young people must be inherent in a declaration on future generations, as each generation must confront the challenges and opportunities of the next generation. On the second major policy, global policy framework, presented in our report, rapid advancements in technology pose ever-increasing risks to the protection of human rights, even as they create opportunities for development. The absence of a holistic, networked, and multilateral approach to technological governance necessitates a global digital compact based on a framework that addresses three key dimensions of the technological life cycle. The first one would be innovation, the second one would be infrastructure, and the third one would be information. And for those who would like to delve more into these three elements, I invite them to consult the report, which will be available online as well. Third and finally, we're talking here about the three frameworks. Third and finally, the spirit of the original 1992 Agenda for Peace can be recaptured by a new and dynamic approach to sustaining peace and promoting a mutually reinforcing approach to justice and security. In the 21st century, that focuses on prevention, on the changing nature of conflict, inclusiveness, and the UN collective security architecture reform. On the urgent need for reinvigorated conflict prevention at local, regional, and international levels, for instance, this could be or could entail the prioritization of new foresight capabilities, an enhanced political role for UN resident coordinators, a new peace-building commission audit tool, and new disarmament measures. And to achieve great inclusiveness and international peace building, we recommend innovating the Women, Peace and Security and Youth Peace and Security agendas through targeted investments in education and a policy opportunity approach that transforms the violence of exclusion into trust and partnerships. Perhaps in ways incomparable to earlier, less globally integrated generations, this is a time for imaginative thinking, skillful diplomacy, and multi-stakeholder coalition building, and most of all, courage. In support of these and related forward-leaning proposals, the stakes could not be higher. Our hope, that this report on rethinking global cooperation will inform a rich and open interchange of ideas and bolster efforts to achieve a more peaceful, just, and sustainable world. By rethinking global cooperation through novel and lasting partnerships, we can ensure that the future we want becomes reality of today's younger generation and all the future generations. I thank you very much, and I would like once again to thank our colleagues at the Stimson Center. This has been a very fruitful partnership. Thank you, Mrs. Namazi. Thanks to Brian, to Richard, and all the colleagues.
Excellency Lolo Al-Khater, thank you very much for that, for helping us understand and contextualize this report, and for also, I guess, putting into perspective the framework for collective action, which could not be more important at this time. Thank you for that. I would like now to hand it over to Brian Finlay, the President and CEO of the Stimson Center.
Miriam, thank you so much. It's so nice to be managed by a pro when we're doing these, and you certainly excel at that. We're grateful to you for making the time to do this. And Your Excellency, as always, such a pleasure to even not in 3 dimensions to see you. I wish we could do this in person, but this is the next best. This is the next best thing. As you both mentioned today, this is the 4th consecutive year of our partnership with the Doha Forum. And while I cannot have favorites, I will confess to this group, as long as we keep it in this room, that this has become my favorite annual ritual. So Loba, thank you again so much for facilitating this. My Stimson colleagues and I are led, of course, by the incomparable Richard Ponzio, whom you will be hearing from in just a few minutes. Are really grateful for, excuse me, the breadth and the ambition of this research collaboration, which has grown significantly over the course of the past several years. And Lola, again, I think this is testament to your own ambitions in the global governance space. For a second year running as well, we have benefited from the research and writing support I just want to call out, and overall intellectual creativity from two small but diverse and talented graduate student teams. They are based at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha and at the New School here in New York City. On behalf of Stimson, I want to express our heartfelt thanks and appreciation to these valued partners, as well as to the large consortium of other individuals and organizations, peer reviewers, all listed in the acknowledgement section of the Rethinking Global Cooperation Report. And I really do commend this study to all of you. I thought since Loa has spoken to the report's main overarching themes, and I know my colleagues will further elaborate on these in the moderated discussion ahead, let me use just a couple of brief moments to speak about the specific measures from getting here to there. As you're aware, Stimson really prides itself not just on studying and on admiring a problem, but at proposing tangible actions to move current challenges and address current challenges in a much more tangible way. And I know, Lalwa, your government shares those overarching objectives as well. Practically speaking, it is our belief that each of the three policy frameworks that Lalwa mentioned and are encapsulated in the report and that we have proposed would benefit from the formation of a task force or a committee led by one permanent representative from the Global North and one from the Global South. We believe that it could be placed, that these structures could be placed under one of the Pact for Future's proposed thematic pillars and given requisite support by the UN Secretariat itself. In addition, it's our belief that independent research can also be and should also be commissioned from academia, from policy researchers from around the world to inform the work of these three task forces. And certainly that should include the substantive inputs and perspectives of other diverse actors from across civil society around the world. Given the policy complexities, the large number of policy issues being deliberated, and the accelerated time frame for the Summit of the Future, civil society, like those assembled today, those joining us online, could play, we believe, a constructive role in finalizing the ambitious goals, helping to carry water within the Pact for the Future and associated policy frameworks. Meaningful civil society engagement in the spirit of more networked, inclusive, and effective multilateralism in the summit's preparations can reassure all stakeholders that decisions taken are well informed, they enjoy broad social ownership, and generate a sense of co-responsibility in supporting their implementation. We think such collaboration could include, by way of example, ensuring that the intergovernmental negotiations both welcome and deliberate on substantive inputs provided by scholars, by non-governmental organizations, major groups, business leaders, and of course, parliamentarians. Second, opening formal negotiations to public observation. Third, supporting national, regional, and global multi-stakeholder forums in the run-up to the summit. And finally, encouraging the involvement of civil society, parliamentarians, and others in national delegations preparing for the summit. The last time the UN attempted a comprehensive overhaul of the entire system was September 2005, when world leaders gathered during the UNGA High-Level Week to mark the 60th anniversary of the organization. And when it comes to the difficult work of the UN, I think it's easy to focus on our failures as we look at the past. While expansion of the Security Council at that time failed and the ambitious disarmament goals were not realized, a new peacebuilding architecture and a responsibility to protect norm were introduced, and the enfeebled Human Rights Council was upgraded to an empowered council with tools such as Universal Periodic Review to better promote safeguards in human rights. I think focusing on our successes is as important as learning from the failures of the past. To me, this demonstrates that positive change is possible, even when it is not easy. Now, nearly a decade later, the Summit of the Future can help realize the vision described in our common agenda. And I hope we all recognize this as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to renew our global governance structures and treat it so. In short, it must not be squandered, this opportunity, not least because time is running out to tackle the conflict drivers that may spread and pit great powers against one another in open confrontation, to protect millions from falling into abject poverty, and perhaps most distressingly of all, to reverse the most severe impacts of climate change. To conclude, although the arc of history is long, it is also the case that the aspirations of billions around the world necessitate altering our global governance towards one that values cooperation over discord, scientific evidence over disinformation, and most of all, the embrace of human dignity and a rich notion of positive peace, where all peoples and nations have the opportunity to live in free, safe, and habitable societies. Without institutional and normative reforms, we need mobilized through a coalition of states, businesses, and civil society partners, the future we want could indeed be out of reach. But Miriam, we are an optimistic group, and we know that these are achievable goals. And so we look forward at Stimson in joining our partners assembled on this session with the Doha Forum, LOLWA with your government, in ensuring that we make this vision captured in the report a reality. And with that, Miriam, I will turn the floor back to you.
That's great. And Brian, you've given us a great quote to kick off our discussion: focus on success, learn from mistakes. So thank you very much for that. And thank you as well to Her Excellency Lola Al-Kharter. And so now I guess we can bring in the other speakers. Very pleased to introduce them to you so we can get into the substance and the detail of this report. So let me bring in now, joining us is Poonam Rimra, and I do hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. You must forgive me if I make any errors with this. We have Poonam Rimra, a member of the Secretary General's new high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism, a 2021 Next Generation Fellow, and a former head of the International Processes Commission at the International Forestry Students Association. Thank you for being with us, Poonam. Also with us today is Nodara Youssef, Global Governance Innovation Network Facilitator at the Stimson Center and Global Youth Coordinator for the Coalition for the UN We Need. We have also Mr. Michael Collins. Michael is Executive Director of the Americas, the Institute for Economics and Peace. Muzna Siddiqui is also joining us, former research consultant for both the Stimson Center's Global Governance Center Justice and Security Program and High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. And finally, I should say, last but not least, Dr. Richard Ponzio. Richard is a Senior Fellow and Director of Global Governance, Justice and Security Program at the Stimson Center. So we will have a couple of questions to our panelists and then hope to get some Q&A from all of you. Of course, I think you're all watching on the YouTube live stream. We're on a different platform, but anyway, you can send your questions through on the little chat window on YouTube. Of course, there is also, not to forget, there is also Twitter. If anyone's on Twitter, hashtag RGC launch on Twitter. And then there's also email, ggin@stimson.org. Please do send through your comments, questions, concerns, everything, sharing your name and your affiliation as well. So I want to start with a couple of questions to our speakers now, and I'll start with Nodara, because Nodara, you led the team on the Declaration on Future Generations. The Declaration on Future Generations is a particular section of this report. Now, in recent weeks, there has been an elements paper as a result of these negotiations that have been facilitated by Fiji and the Netherlands, all this taking place at the UN. We've heard about some of the overall themes through which the declaration could be approached, but drawing on the research for this report, could you just tell us some of the ways in which this declaration can be operationalized?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Marianne, and thank you for those joining us in person today and also online. And I think this is the key pivot point, right? Is because there's already been in 1997 a UNESCO declaration on the responsibility towards future generations. So the principle's been out there for almost 2 decades. What we're suggesting in this report is taking that principle and really operationalizing it. I think that will be the pivot point of this declaration on future generations, is to build in the operational mechanisms into the declaration itself. And so what are some of these suggestions, to come to your question, Miriam, that we provide? And these are based on, so they're not sort of from thin air. These are based on mappings that we did, the team, that's Gaurav, Jada, Farwa, and Maddie have supported our research in this particular chapter, conducted based on national attempts that have already taken place to include future generations policy at the national level. So for example, we saw policies from legal, political and normative lenses come out of Barbados, Hungary, Wales, as well as several other countries. But also we looked at knowledge and action gaps caused by differing incentives and ad hoc agendas at the global level. So gaps such as the lack of development in future generations and foresight-based initiatives outside of climate. So oftentimes when you think of future generations, the conversation sort of centers around environment and climate governance. So the team looked at what other areas of foresight are sort of possible and out there. But also, for example, the lack of a rights-based approach to representing future generations. So one set of the operational proposals that we suggested building into the Declaration on Future Generations includes a Council for Future Generations, a Future Generations Review, and an Intergenerational Solidarity Index. So the Council would provide a platform to convene multiple stakeholders that work on future generations. So to create a sort of proxy deliberative forum to speak on behalf of future generations and bring together stakeholders working on the same. We also propose a Futures Lab that would be, and this comes off the back of an Our Common Agenda proposal that would support such a platform to increase capacity building of different countries. Some countries already have the foresight machinery to be able to channel and then investigate and research on future generations, but having some kind of lab to support other countries as well. The Future Generations Review, we suggest being a universal periodic review supported by an intergenerational solidarity index. And this is really to hit the idea of incentive structures. So the report goes into, in some depth, the idea of political incentives when it comes to addressing future generations policies and how we can bring incentive forward, make policymakers care about what happens in 10 years down the line, 10 generations down the line today. So that's some of the things that we sort of think about in the report and think about how we can encourage people to operationalize this. But the report also discusses different ways to approach these operational mechanisms. So for example, this council that we suggest on future generations, we say could be either repurposing the existing trusteeship council or potentially proposing a new stewardship council, and the pros and cons of these different ways to sort of exemplify our recommendations. We look at, for example, a universal periodic review versus a voluntary national review process and nationally determined contributions. Again, the pros and cons are the same and the gaps that we need to be filled in the process of doing that. But we also consider a special envoy on future generations. And this again is proposed by the Secretary General in his Our Common Agenda report, which came out September 2021. But it wasn't elaborated on. So we do elaborate on this a little bit. We think of 6 sort of specific facets to it. The first is the envoy acting as an advocate. The second is the envoy having a 5-year term, so building in some longevity, but still having cycles where the envoy has similar incentive structures to political cycles, so seeing how those sort of match up. The third is having the envoy's office act as a secretariat for this council body that we suggest, so again, tying together all of these operational mechanisms. The fourth sort of thing would be the envoy's role in liaising with key agencies. So for example, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Human Rights Council, the new UN Youth Office that's being established, the Office of the UN Youth Envoy, so key stakeholders that would sort of specifically be interested in future generations, but also other agencies. So also making sure that, for example, the development programs, the environmental programs, so within the UN as well, are thinking of future generations. The fifth is sort of being a champion for vulnerable voices and marginalized groups. So where the state doesn't always have the capacity to engage on all fronts, making sure the envoy is picking up and championing voices of change. For example, indigenous philosophies have been discussing future generations for years and years and years, but we're only sort of picking it up in the mainstream. So finding those voices that have already had these conversations. And finally, really supercharging the 2030 agenda with the help of the Futures Lab and sort of building those synergies as well. So that, Miriam, is a sort of quick answer to your question, and I've given you a brief taste of what's in the report. I do hope you get the chance to read it. But just to say that we have really thought about how we're going to make this 2022, 2023, 2024, whenever the declaration comes out, version that much more operationally successful than potentially the 1997. But back to you, Maria.
But very important point you make about the well-being of future generations, and you alluded to it a little bit there about the sort of short-term nature of political cycles and the tendency to focus on the immediate challenges, particularly now. And I feel as though that has been the case more and more as we see sort of increasing global instability and shocks, if you like, to the global political economy. But maybe we can touch on those issues a bit later on in this discussion. I do want to now come to Poonam. Now, Poonam, you are a member of the high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism. And now they had a public statement recently focusing on the themes of environmental governance, digital governance, peace and security, and the global financial architecture. I want to ask you now how you see a declaration on future generations, which is underway by UN member states in New York. How do you see this fitting into these broad categories for the forthcoming report?
Thank you, Mariam. I'm really glad to be here today. First of all, I would like to connect how high-level advisory boards work and the report that we are launching today aligns with each other. I really appreciated the framing of the current moments articulated in the foreword of the Rethinking Global Cooperation report that we are launching here, which states, perhaps in a way incomparable to earlier, less globally integrated generations, this is a time for imaginative thinking, skillful diplomacy, and coalition building, and most of all, courage. In support of these and related proposals spearheaded by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, the stakes couldn't be higher. So the gravity of current crisis and compounding conflicts facing us today are at the heart of what we are considering at High-Level Advisory Board, which you rightly mentioned at the heart. It's focused on the digital governance, peace and security, the global financial architecture, and climate and energy. Now, our intention is not to dictate on what ought to be included in any of the forthcoming policy frameworks, may that be Global Digital Compact or the new Agenda for Peace, but to present the possible solutions born out of extensive consultations with a wide range of multiple stakeholders, subject matter experts, UN and member state officials, civil society groups, and most important to me, a diversity of young people and youth leaders across the world to tackle the key challenges and the interconnectivity of conflict, climate, debt, development, and many more. So I want to make it clear that conversations about future generations do not only center around youth issues, because the goal is not just youth inclusion or the access of quality education or other things that are seen as problems for young people, but everything that we are discussing here today has a dramatic impact on the future health of our planet. and the success or struggle of future generations. So without peace, without food, without health or good finance or development, we leave very little hope of prosperity for the generations that will be succeeding us. So the interconnectivity that has been starkly evidenced by the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war is at the heart of these issues. So at high-level advisory board, we are connecting our work, we are conducting our work in such a way that the interconnectivity is at the center, and it is the center theme. Everything in knowing that climate change presents security risks, and the poor global financial architecture can hinder the progress and development, and many more other interconnected themes that goes in the world. So in this sense, it is my sincere hope that our high-level advisory board report and the forthcoming declaration on future generations will work in tandem and help in part to form the comprehensive roadmap for the solutions and change that we desperately need. We are aiming to publish our report in the spring 2023, and the recommendations we hope can inform this report as well as many other upcoming policy processes. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Poonam, do appreciate your contribution there. And actually, I want to come to Richard now, because that leads me nicely to you. Beyond this declaration on future generations, Richard, another very important part of this report was the focus on the Secretary General's call for a new agenda for peace. Now, why is the time right for this sort of thing, and what should the priorities be?
Thank you, Miriam. And I'd like to take this opportunity at the outset to thank our amazing report team, our partners in Doha, the Doha Forum, and of course, all of you participating in today's program. Let me start by sharing that in the 1990s, as a student, and then as a UN peacebuilding practitioner in the first decade of the 2000s, I was a big fan, I think like many in this room, of the 1992 Agenda for Peace, required reading in graduate school. Especially how it advanced both original thinking, but the application is what I observed at the country level and the work of the UN on these critical concepts: conflict prevention, peacemaking, peacekeeping, and post-conflict peace building. As we detail in our report, times have certainly changed over the past 2 to 3 decades. And Miriam, you asked why the time is right now for a new agenda for peace. Well, we argue, first and foremost, that modern conflicts have become multidimensional in character due to climate change, cyber warfare, resource rivalry amidst rising population demands, record numbers of displaced and refugees, worldwide pandemic diseases, as we've all observed the last 2-3 years, and resurgent authoritarianism. Yet, even as tools for examining factors driving deadly conflict have advanced, we've seen an uptick in conflict over political violence over the past decade. That's something that I think Michael will speak to in the work of the Institute for Economics and Peace. But we also observed a lack of a coherent and comprehensive approach to conflict prevention, which stymies effective UN responses to simmering future conflicts, whether of a local nature, national, and even, of course, global. In short, then, we concluded that the spirit of the original 1992 Agenda for Peace can be recaptured by a new and dynamic approach to sustaining peace. And we outlined 4 specific ideas for bringing to life this new agenda. First, an emphasis on prevention. Reinvigorated conflict prevention at local, regional, and international levels could prioritize new foresight capabilities, an enhanced political role for the UN resident coordinators operating at the country level. And here they would have the support of even more peace and development advisors who have really shown their contributions at the country level. At the headquarters level, though, in recent years, the Secretary General has a high-level board on mediation, as well as for about 15, 16 years, the mediation support unit of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs can all, of course, backstop the new political role of UN resident coordinators, I think in 125, 130 countries worldwide. Other areas of this prevention agenda, though, a peace-building audit, which we've written extensively over the past decade about in connection with an upgraded peace-building commission to a council. This would be a tool modeled on the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council, which was part of its changes during the 60th anniversary of the UN that Brian Finley referred to. And finally, issues around disarmament. And of course, I think top of mind for many people are new technologies such as artificial intelligence, killer robots. But of course, we still need to deal with conventional weapons, small arms, and light weapons. And then, of course, it's been in the news quite a bit lately, weapons of mass destruction, starting with nukes. A second area, though, we examined was the changing nature of conflict, specifically climate change and water security, cyber warfare. This would include disinformation and misinformation, and the two-way interplay between sustainable security and a healthy global commons. We thought all three of these areas merited special attention in the new agenda for peace. So to address climate crisis-related security threats, proactive forms of hydrodiplomacy, new regional governance mechanisms, and legally binding transboundary water governance commitments are urgently needed. In response to current cyber threats, we lend support to calls for a legally binding Geneva Digital Convention, our Digital Geneva Convention, that would establish norms and protocols to protect civilians on the internet and regulate state behavior in cyberspace. Finally, to better cope with the quote, with the tragedy of the commons, as it's often called, existing multilateral agreements on the global commons must be updated or in some cases signed and ratified by certain states. Here we gave special attention to the Law of the Sea, from 1982, needing to update that to focus on climate change and excessive resource depletion, as well as updating the Space Treaty, which was all the way back to the 1960s. And there's definitely a lot that's been happening in the global common known as outer space. Thirdly, we focused in this section of the report on the notion of inclusiveness, giving special attention to innovating the women, peace and security and youth peace and security agendas of the past 2 decades. Through targeted investments in education, we also witnessed last week the Transforming Education Summit, and what we call a policy opportunity approach that transforms the violence of exclusion into trust and partnerships. And then fourth and finally, we recommended that in light of the war in Ukraine on everybody's television screens throughout this past year, but other ongoing crises throughout the world, the new agenda for peace must give ample attention to UN collective security architecture reform. Here we're of course referring to what I like to call the big three, the Security Council, which gets most of the attention on these types of discussions, the General Assembly and Uniting for Peace resolution and coming on strong in connection with the Ukraine crisis in the past few months, and of course the Peacebuilding Commission that I noted earlier. The other new idea that the Secretary General introduced that we gave attention in helping flesh out ideas on from our common agenda a year ago, the emergency platform idea. And for all of these, I won't have time to go into detail. If there's interest during Q&A, we hope to answer further questions, and it's all in the report, of course. But we dealt with issues, of course, of membership configurations, new tools of an operational nature that would connect to these intergovernmental bodies in New York, and then new modes of non-traditional engagement with regional organizations, local organizations, and a whole range of non-state actors involved in these 4 key concepts from the current agenda for peace: conflict prevention, peacemaking, peacekeeping, and post-conflict peace building. I'll stop there. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that, Richard. And I thought one thing that was particularly important in this report, and it's something that is easily overlooked in the sort of frenetic news cycle and the heat of battle and conflict. We cover traditional warfare, but cyber warfare, including falsehood and misinformation, and the way in which obviously that affects people, the way in which it is a threat to human rights, and the way in which it can exacerbate conflict. Very important point there within the report as well. So thank you very much for that, Richard. Michael, you are with us. Hello,
Yes,
Michael.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, just checking. Okay, so Michael, I want to ask you about this bit of the report, the new agenda for peace. what would you say are the most significant recommendations here? And within sort of constraints that already exist that Richard was just alluding to in the current geopolitical climate, how can these proposals be taken forward and hopefully adopted by the September 24 summit for the future?
Great, thank you very much, Miriam, and perhaps just to kind of sort of start on what you both ended on the elements related to sort of digital, warfare or digital peacekeeping or peace building. I think, in many ways we're already behind the curve, right? But also Summit of the Future provides a fantastic bookend to be able to get something very discrete accomplished before then. You were talking about sort of fake news and false information, disinformation. I feel that a lot of these conversations related to sort of, freedom of speech and human rights are still things that we are very much tackling and debating in the physical world. So TBD, how much physical progress could be made in the digital sphere. But I think Richard noted, for example, that the Digital Geneva Convention as potentially a very concrete starting point and something that could potentially be accomplished before sort of a summit of the future. Centered largely around, civilian protection primarily, right? Whether that ends up being sort of an additional protocol in the existing Geneva Convention or something completely new is kind of sort of TBD. And, one of the reasons I think in part is because there already seems to be significant support from the tech community and, something championed by Microsoft. And I'm pretty sure that the Facebooks of the world would love to have something very concrete to be able to latch onto that can kind of sort of provide a good basis. Two other kind of sort of key recommendations that particularly within my sphere, I suppose you could say, is this idea of strengthening the international foresight, largely in relation to the statistical correlations that already exist between a lot of the SDG outcomes and improvements or deteriorations in peacefulness over time. So it is possible with the data that we have available globally today, with data that, public data that the UN and UN bodies already have access to be able to come to a much better determination as to what is the likelihood of which countries are likely to deteriorate or improve in peacefulness over the next 3 to 5 to 10 year window. So that is something that is physically possible now. It can be built on existing mechanisms such as Nadara yesterday, you were talking about the Horizon scan within the Secretariat, and the various other things there. I think one of the ongoing challenges is this focus, this remaining focus on negative peace rather than exploring these broader correlations. So simplifying kind of sort of grossly, what we're trying to do currently, or the thinking is, okay, well, let's focus on negative peace indicators such as rising violent demonstrations, for example, to be able to identify where the next crisis is going to be. Of course, that's going to happen in a year. You're already too late to the game, right? But if you can focus on a myriad of different indicators that are shown to have those statistic correlations, rising levels of unemployment or reducing quality of education, and a whole sort of plethora of these can be looked at to be able to get better ideas. And then you have this 3 to 5 to 10 year window to be able to develop better interventions. I say interventions, kind of one of my concerns is that even though those abilities do exist and I think can be leveraged a lot more than they currently are, one needs to be very careful about how that is kind of sort of applied. Minority Report kind of sort of comes to mind in a certain way, that it can serve to be able to help early mediation efforts, diplomacy, technical exchanges between countries, for example, but not something that can be sort of used to create this spectrum of intervention. And then lastly, in terms of sort of roles and responsibilities in the peacekeeping or peacebuilding arena, and if there was any pushback that I had on the current report, it would be, are we trying to kind of sort of do too much? It does talk very eloquently, both the Our Common Agenda and this report, about how peacekeeping and peacebuilding encompasses all of these spheres, including the SDGs. But there is something kind of neat and tidy about, negative peace, right? The UN's role with regards to mediation, specifically in civilian protection, very nice, very, very compact. But taking note of these distinct connections with all of the other work that the UN does, and especially in relation to the Peacebuilding Commission and the Peacebuilding Support, Peacebuilding Support Office, and the Peacebuilding Fund as well, these three primary mechanisms, is there an opportunity to be able to turn this inward, right? To be able to kind of sort of permanently look at the impact of the UN from a systems perspective. Each of the UN's different programs and interventions and the General Assembly and all of the different UN bodies contribute to peace in a meaningful way. You know, we're in an ideal position to not necessarily look out to as to what the UN can do, but better evaluate what the UN is doing internally and have dedicated bodies, right? Precisely looking at all of the different interventions, all of the different ways we are operating, and potentially lead UN reform from within, looking inwards. I feel in many ways that would gain a lot more acceptance because—
Michael, can I ask you, how I'm just curious, how difficult is that going to be? You know, we just, in our Al Jazeera NewsHour last night, we were covering developments at the United Nations Security Council, yet another resolution that had no hope of passing because of the sort of logjam that we've all become accustomed to. And so, you know, now that initiative will move to the UN General Assembly. I mean, that's something we've seen play out many times before. It's on an international issue, but, you know, I'm just wondering about, when you speak about internal bodies, think about the member states and obviously the differing views on the UN Security Council. I mean, those divisions exist on the issue of digital governance, do they not?
So I think you raise a great question, Miriam, and I think actually that is one of the ongoing challenges that we have, is that, you know, we often talk about, you know, idealism versus pragmatism, and it's not a question of the lowest common denominator, but the thing that we can agree, you know, that we can only agree on extremely basic things, right? At an international community level. And that's why things like the Geneva Convention are things that are very concrete, very clear. But as and when, I mean, for example, we've just completed some research right now, as we see these multiple different kind of sort of not only UN bodies, but different treaties, different agreements that have come into place every year, general acceptance and compliance with these treaties has actually gone down. So there is value in keeping things very clear and very concrete. The reference I was making to sort of was not necessarily to create a new internal body, but right now within the UN, you have all of these different structures, you have all of these different bodies, you have UN Women, you have UNDP, you have UNESCO, you have UN Peacekeeping, you have all of these different things. Being able to look at that and to be able to essentially manage that and internally monitor it, right? It's almost a monitoring and evaluation exercise, right, from a peacebuilding perspective that can be undertaken by the Peacebuilding Commission.
Whoever said you were too ambitious was wrong. Okay. Thank you very much for that, Michael. We'll come back to you, but just want to now go to Muzna, because Muzna, you led the Stimson team's research in the area of digital cooperation and global governance. So that leads us nicely to you. And of course, we now have the very fast pace of technological developments in recent years, don't we? And the impact that that is having on society and also on international relations. So with that in mind, what can this global digital compact hope to achieve?
Yes, thank you very much, Mariam, for that question. And as you very well said, developments in technology have truly accelerated at a really unmatched pace, and policymakers and politicians alike have struggled really to keep up with this rapid change. In fact, the issue of governing technology effectively is so subjective and so complex in nature that we find varying approaches across the world. So, for instance, certain governments have sought to curtail the use of technology and the opportunities that it provides via the freedom and expression of human rights, whereas others instead struggle with providing too much leverage to actors such as technology companies, which in turn then poses a different risk to human rights, such as, for example, through breaches in data privacy. Therefore, it's very, very clear that given the fact that technologies such as the internet and social media transverses boundaries and borders, that a networked, multilateral, and also a multi-stakeholder response is needed to ensure that technology is being both used and governed benevolently, and also to protect those fundamental human rights, which I mentioned earlier as well. Therefore, a global coordinated response is really what is needed at this point. And there have been previous attempts to bring together a coalition of stakeholders on specific issues surrounding technology. For instance, we have the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on digital cooperation, and more recently, UNESCO's working group on AI capacity building, for example. But these processes haven't necessarily been entirely inclusive or open to the public and civil society, and also not entirely holistic and thorough enough in their content. Therefore, the Global Digital Compact then provides a unique and really excellent opportunity, I would say, to address this lacuna and also to create a set of global principles on the most key aspects and facets of technology. So this includes introducing principles which simultaneously address the innovation or ideation of technology, its infrastructure and the availability of its access, and also its information, which is how it's being used by individuals and communities. And it also provides an opportunity to ensure that a diverse coalition of individuals, communities, businesses, and governments can contribute to the creation of norms and technology at this global level, which can then hopefully trickle down to governance and businesses as well. So in terms of what it can hope to achieve, the Digital Compact at this point is really a blank slate, and it's up to us as the stakeholders to shape this vision of global common principles, which not only apply towards the present iteration of technologies, but are also hopefully flexible enough to and adaptable enough as well in its nature to apply for future iterations of technologies. And a key way of grounding the GDC or the Digital Compact it would be in the foundation of human rights rather than grounding it in the technology itself. So this means that, for example, rather than looking at AI and how we can govern it responsibly, instead we can switch that around and start thinking about how, for example, the right to equality can be used and applied in the development and governance of AI. So it's really switching around how we approach the same issue. And also, in addition to setting a common vision and goal for all stakeholders, which allows for the governance of technology, the compact can also hopefully serve to reaffirm these human rights whilst ensuring that technology is being used in a way which really benefits individuals and also the environment in the most sustainable and most effective way. But the time for the Digital Compact is now, and it cannot really be delayed. There is enough political momentum and an understanding of the risks that are being posed by technology, as was being mentioned earlier, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we really have seen disinformation and misinformation reach new heights and also be very threatening to human rights as well. And this really highlights why there is a great likelihood of success for this initiative now leading up to the Summit of the Future.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed for that, Mohsen. I appreciate it. Just going to ask a couple of more questions and then we'll go to Q&A. Won't be long before we do that. Just a quick reminder that you can send in your questions on YouTube. Of course, you're watching there on the live streaming feed. You can enter your questions into the chat window and then also on Twitter, #RGCLaunch. So I'll get to your questions very shortly. First, though, I just want to ask Michael a question. Michael, if I can come back to you for a moment. Now, we were speaking a little bit about the changing nature of conflict, and both you and Richard spoke about this. What is your research center? What is it? Tell us what it's found in terms of the connection between resource scarcity and the future of conflict, because I understand that you, along with your colleagues at Stimson, is going to develop a sort of a diagnostic tracking tool for exploring the global response to these connections. Just break that down for us, explain it a little bit.
Sure, Miriam, I'd be delighted, and Richard, do feel free to jump in. But I mean, I think the group really already sort of very eloquently spoke to the backdrop, right, which is essentially, you know, record levels of lack of peace. We produced the Global Peace Index. They've been doing it for over 16 years. This is the year that the least level of peacefulness that we've seen globally since the inception of the index, right? That's on aggregate, but it's also across a whole variety of kind of sort of indicators, violent demonstrations of refugee flows being some of them. And then there's kind of sort of like the backdrop to the backdrop, which was also eloquently described to the group in terms of rising food insecurity and, you know, the expected ongoing rise of food insecurity over the next 25 and 30 years. So, you know, we've been doing a lot of research with regards to the connection, if you will, between ecological threats, food security being an element of that, but also elements related to climate change, rapid population growth, for example, both food and water insecurity and water stress, but also things like temperature anomalies. and looking at that, how that correlates to levels of conflict around the world. So just to give a couple of examples, 11 of the 15 countries facing the most severe ecological threats are countries that are already in conflict. The remaining 4 of those are likely to significantly deteriorate in peacefulness in the future. The 3 regions that have the highest exposure to ecological threats, sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East and South Asia, also the 3 least peaceful regions. Afghanistan, for example, right, the least peaceful country on earth currently right now, has extremely high levels of ecological threats across all of those sort of administrative units as well. So, you know, the connection between resource scarcity and conflict is there, and potentially goes back through kind of sort of a sense of time and really feeds in itself in a negative dynamic. So a lot of what the things that we intuitively feel are true, we are definitely seeing through the research. You know, a couple of sort of key elements there that we think have a lot of potential is obviously improvements in governance generally and resource management. Now, with regards to the specific research initiative that we're exploring, one of the things that we thought would be particularly relevant, especially with regards to the OCA and the exploration of not only the global commons, but also the global public goods, is to see what countries are the ones that are in a best position to be able to advise and potentially lead with issues of global governance as it relates to sustainable living. Which are the countries that are living most sustainably and that are nurturing in the best possible way the variety of global public goods being discussed in the OCA. So we aim to do this both in terms of how individual countries are committing to the international community or performing with regards to their involvement in the international community, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, what they're doing at a sovereign level as well. So there's a whole lot of stuff to unpack. We've only just started, but
Michael, maybe I can put this question to you actually from Dan Perel, excuse me if I mispronounce that, co-chair of the Coalition for the UN We Need Steering Committees, so asking, you know, what opportunities do the authors see to overcome the trust deficit in global governance? And the public trust deficit is such a big issue and perhaps, you know, something that lies at the heart of some of the biggest political trends of our time, but more specifically, how can these 3 global policy frameworks on future generations, digital cooperation, sustaining peace, serve as a way to build greater confidence in institutions as a whole? I mean, you know, how can it be used to restore public trust and confidence?
Sure. Well, I'd be extremely happy to share this with the group. I realize that I've been speaking a lot, but I mean, I'm definitely very happy to kind of sort of touch on it. Maybe something to what you mentioned before with regards to false information. You know, we've just completed some research as an input paper to the Human Development Report, which talks about this paradox, right, between general improvements in socioeconomic development and improvements in institutions and in governments globally, whereas we've been seeing this deterioration in attitudes and the way that we are treating each other and the levels of trust and social cohesion that exist around the world. So that is kind of sort of interesting, given the fact that a lot of the fundamental things that we would think are leading to increased violent demonstrations, for example, are not necessarily the case, although that is the case in places, for example, like North America and Western Europe. So I think there is definitely a lot that can and should be explored in that particular kind of sort of space about free flow of information, ensuring quality access to information from our perspective, especially as it relates to the research. Well, you know, as much, if not entire, transparency and accountability, both with regards to the products that we develop and the information that we aim to exchange.
Thank you very much for that, Michael. Now, actually, I was going to come to Poonam because you've been a very strong advocate, Poonam, for responsible climate policies, you know, the greatest challenge of our time, and one that will only become more and more important when you look at some of the trends and the weather events that we're seeing really affecting every continent in the world. But actually, rather than me asking the question, why don't I bring in Farwa Amar, who is actually does want to ask a question about climate and peace building. I think Farwa is standing by, so I will let you ask your question.
Sorry, Miriam, it's a question for Farwa from Mayara Foley, and the question is, what can, and Mayra Foley is from the Brazilian think tank Plataforma CIPO. And the question is, what can be done to ensure that the new agenda for peace addresses the destabilizing effects of climate change? And our colleague Farwa Amer with the Energy and Environment Program at the Stimson Center will field that question.
Okay, so that's great. Okay, Farwa, if you can answer that question. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Richard. I'm glad to be here during this launch, this fantastic report. Also, we kind of touched upon that in the report as well. When we look at the idea, I mean, climate change apocalypse is here. We're all feeling it this year. It's been quite a revelation in terms of the weather events, extreme weather events happening one after the other. And now the conversation is not only restricted to what we once considered the global south, the most vulnerable regions to climate change. It's happening all over the world now. So how do we make sure that the new agenda for peace, or just the multilateral forums and in general policy framework, can support a more effective response to climate change that will be working towards more adaptation and resilience building? Unfortunately, what has been happening is that these conversations have been decentralized all along. Now it's time to kind of consolidate. SDG 5, SDG 6, SDG 7, they're all kind of like interrelated. These conversations need to happen in a more consolidated manner, not in silos. We should be bringing things together. It has to be more multi-stakeholder. There has to be more support on the public-private sector front. Of course, we need to get field players involved and kind of have a bottom-up approach in implementing some of these policies going forward. When you talk about climate mitigation and adaptation, enhancing the effects of these mitigation effects kind of will hinge on international policy coordination. So that is very important. And that's where frameworks like, in the new agenda for peace can play a very important role. And I can go on and on about what can be done in different sectors and looking at climate change and its effects on energy, food, and water, what have you. But it's important that you're moving towards a global transition, not only for a low carbon economy, but also moving towards one that looks at natural resources related conflicts and induced migration patterns, and also what happens to each of the marginalized groups in these conversations. So it has to be a policy that is holistic in its nature and viable and not a cookie cutter approach as well. So what works as a best practice in one region can be inspiring to another, but the policymakers have to be careful that each region, each country, and each community, they factor in the requirements of the social fabric that exists within that area and involve those people as the policy implementation takes place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farwa. Now we have a question here from Professor Joris Larik from Leiden University. Apologies if I mispronounce that. And also from the Global Governance Innovation Network. And I don't know which of you would like to take this question. Maybe Richard, this could be one for you. Now, it's a good question actually about the Summit of the Future, which has been postponed to September 2024. And according to the panelists, which is the best way to use this extra time to make the summit a breakthrough? But Richard, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the report is suggesting that it would be better for the summit to be held sooner rather than later.
So we commented on some of the tensions among member states in the preparation of modalities resolution, a roadmap, the game plan for what was supposed to have been, as called for by the Secretary General, a process leading up to September 2023. There will be a ministerial meeting in a year's time, and that's important because a lot of work needs to start right away. Co-facilitators will be appointed at the end of October to get that formal intergovernmental process going. But, alas, we cannot dismiss the tensions that we saw in this modalities resolution and some of the steps leading up to it over this past few months. And besides debates about kicking the main summit back a year, there were at least two major camps, and they could be pretty much summed up in terms of being led by Pakistan on behalf of the G77, although there was not consensus within the G77 by any stretch, Brazil, Russia, and then several other countries, but in another camp, really Western countries, the US, EU, Japan, but many other countries wanting to accelerate this process. So that was perhaps the most important issue of kicking it back one more year. There will be an SDG summit next year, so it's very important that there'll be strong connections there. But the other areas of division were whether or not we should have consensus-based decision-making, which has become, unfortunately, unanimity, where all countries have veto power, or majority voting. Two other areas, though, and near and dear to our research team's heart, engaging civil society actors. The fact that there's still concerns being raised at this day and age about making it a truly multi-stakeholder process is alarming, to be honest. And finally, this high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism, which Poonam is a representative of, they wouldn't even acknowledge it in the modalities resolution, which was a bit of an ominous signal that they're not welcoming further leadership and ideas from the third Secretary General's office, which is absolutely critical. That's how we got to this stage. But to answer the question from Professor Joris Larig at Leiden University, absolutely make the best use of time. And I'll say very quickly 2 points on the civil society front. We had an event during UNGA High Level Week last week where 3 different activities were launched that we welcome this community watching today's program to be active participants in, to mirror the outcome document known as the Pact for the Future. We're going to have a People's Pact for the Future, and online conversations will begin before the end of this year, feeding into probably web-based, but at some point, we hope in-person regional future forums. It's so important that we take these discussions to the regions, to the country, and even local levels. Remember, there were 3,000 consultations at the time of the UN 75 dialogue. We need to get that going again. But all of this feeding into a global futures forum in early part of next year, and hopefully in 2024. We're hoping to do that in New York, and you're all welcome and encouraged. Chapter 6 of this report goes into great detail on a strategy for change and maximizing, in particular, the work on these 3 global policy frameworks. But it's synced up with a larger process, as I said, the Chapeau document, the Pact for the Future, and we have very specific ideas about how that can be organized, because it's complex, it's comprehensive, it's systemic, and there are creative and smart ways of organizing it. And it's so critical that ideas from the research community at the heart of this report, the civil society, the private sector are actively engaged in these discussions. So we're definitely going to maximize the extra year that has been given us. But let's not forget the backdrop of that, which a lot of serious political tensions among great powers on these issues.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Richard. And something that you mentioned there, Richard, that I might ask here now. Well, you mentioned there civil society participation and you know, the importance of engaging as many different actors as possible in terms of finding these solutions and working together. And we actually have a question here from Ted Daly from Citizens for Global Solutions. I'm not sure who wants to take this question, or if we get a quick thought from all of the panelists on this. And Ted says that, says that one thing we've heard too little about in the Summit of the Future conversation is the idea of a UN volunteer force. The UN needs a standing peace force, so it's not relying or pleading with nations to contribute their own forces from scratch every time there is a need to do so. Citizens of the world should be able to volunteer to serve their country, but also to serve humanity. Who would like to take that question?
I'll tackle this one, Mariam. Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you, Sad, for the question as well. I think, you know, the Secretary General in his Our Common Agenda report proposes a model of networked and inclusive multilateralism. So there is scope here to bring in more stakeholders than what we're currently working with. And so, you know, in the report, we propose certain operational avenues to do this. The UN Volunteer Task Force is not featured in this report per se. We're aware that it's an idea that's been out there in the space for a long time and has had pushback for some reasons and has been sort of championed in other facets. But I think it does touch on an important principle of moving beyond engagement just through sort of citizenship and based on sort of national modalities, but also opening up the space of UN and other international institutions, whether it be in the realm of peacekeeping, finance, youth and future generations, or otherwise, opening up the space for civil society participation. So to the extent to which the peacekeeping force itself will gain the traction, and I know that there's a lot of civil society members working on this in a big way, and support for that. But I think it proposes and touches on a very important principle of the Our Common Agenda process, of many of the things we've proposed in this report, which is opening up space for civil society participation beyond just through sometimes the bottlenecks that are produced by solely working with member states.
I have a question here actually from Dr. Joni Kali, United Nations, the ECOSOC representative, saying the UN identifies commons as outer space, high seas, atmosphere, and Antarctica, but our actual commons are broader than that, broader than those four entities. So how can we expand the definition of commons to better address global commonality?
I think Poonam might be able to provide some expertise on this particular question. Poonam?
Yeah, actually, in the high-level advisory board, we are discussing on if we can expand the global public goods and what are commons. But now today, I want to do it the other way. When we are in the panel, we always it is us speaking today, because we in the high-level advisory board we are consulting. Now, I would give or put this question forward to you. What commons do you feel should come out in our future summit report? Do you have any recommendations for us in the board? Yeah, that's my question to you.
Okay, that's great. So yes, put it, and you're putting that out there to the audience. You're just putting it out there as a general idea to the world.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I'll just throw in
stimulate some discussion and debate. Why not? Richard, what do you think?
I'd love to hear on the specific point something that we discussed among the research team, the digital space as a global common. And our resident expert, Muzna, what is your take on that? Is it a pro or a con to label it as a global common? And then should we have treaty type instruments the way we do for the other well-known global commons?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. That's a very direct and straightforward question to a very complicated answer, I would say, in the sense that the unique nature of the global commons is such that obviously it applies across the globe. But then the issue with really governing that, and especially if we start to consider cyberspace as a global commons, is that we have seen the challenges that we are facing in governing the global commons which already exist, the four ones which already exist. And if we view cyberspace from that perspective, I think we would experience certain challenges in that, because I feel like it will be a little bit more difficult to attain global common consensus and common understanding on the very different aspects and facets of cyberspace. Of course, there are a lot of people who have actually argued for this and have put forward the idea that the global commons, that cyberspace should be considered a global commons. But in my opinion, it actually creates more challenges than is necessary, and that it's actually easier and more fruitful and more productive actually to explore the cyberspace from different aspects, which we are already doing, rather than creating an international treaty or so, which would only apply in one specific scenario. And the reason I say this is because even though cyberspace has been around for a while, I personally find it to be a domain which is ever changing. It's constantly developing, and it requires us to keep pace with this. And therefore, it would be much easier for policymakers and for lawmakers as well to approach it from a more segmented perspective when it comes to the specific issues that it raises, rather than creating an overarching treaty, I guess you could say, on cyberspace, which may or may not fill the gaps which are presently there or which may come in the future. But that's just my take on it, although I know that there are proponents of cyberspace as global commons.
Michael.
Yes,
Not sure if you can. Yeah, no, I just wanted to put a question to you actually about this. There's a question from Saida Guliaruz from Georgetown University saying, how would the Global Digital Compact ensure participation of multiple stakeholders from government, private sector, and civil society in discussions about technology regulation and use? Because I suppose one thing that the report does touch on is the international community's very limited response to this.
So I think the answer to that actually coincides with what would have been my answer to the previous question. And that is that, and probably goes back to my comments about the potential of kind of like a digital Geneva Convention being a good bedrock to start from. You know, when we talk about the development of indices, you know, one of the things that we found tremendously useful is to be able to start with an extremely concrete definition, be able to set indicators against that, and to start measuring trends and progress from there, and having something that can be built on over time. One of the dangers that we have when we talk about global commons, and invariably, you know, that it's an infinite list, right, of things that are of general interest to humanity as a whole. So we're going to need to feel comfortable about grossly simplifying that idea down to the point in which there's something very concrete and very bold, very measurable, and then progressively start building that over time. So it's the proverbial pragmatism versus idealism component, but nonetheless very important, for example, for building out agreement towards, you know, what are the protocols or standards that we put in place in the digital arena, but also in terms of the global public common goods. The initiative that we are undertaking with Stimson is actually running counter to some of these recommendations in some respects, because it does aim to cover, for example, the environment, global health, global public security as global public goods. So that in itself is already a very difficult task. But the OCA actually does provide that very concrete framing, because there are things that are specifically mentioned in the R Common agenda, and therefore things that will likely have kind of sort of more traction or be under more debate in the future.
And actually, we're just coming to the end of our time. I'm just wondering if there are any concluding thoughts or any particular part of the report that is significant that our panelists would like to highlight.
I will jump in here, Mariam, with just a quick thought on, because I've also seen some questions come in on future generations, SDG+. There are a couple of questions about the 2030 agenda. So just to address all of that, and a hot topic as well during the negotiations of the Elements paper has been, why is the sort of future generations declaration out there when we already have the 2030 agenda, we already have the Paris Agreement, we already have the Addis Ababa Agreement. So why is it that you want to add an additional kind of framework here and divert resources? That was a big thing that we heard in a lot of the negotiations. So I just want to address that quickly with a concluding thought on why a declaration, why add another instrument. And it's something that we thought sort of very carefully about when we were formulating this chapter of the report. What we don't want to do is reinvent the wheel on the SDGs, a framework that has been around for almost decades in the works, but almost a decade now in the work, but that's not even accounting for the several years of negotiation that went into that. So trying to say this is a reinvention on the SDGs is only taking away from years of progress, years of work. So it's not about reinventing the wheel with the declaration, but rather think of it as there's been a bunch of wheels kind of floating aimlessly down the road to the future, right? You have several global agendas, the Paris Agreement, the SDGs, the Addis Ababa, there's the treaties on the commons, there's sort of several things that are wheels in themselves, have been negotiation processes, and are rolling down the road to the future. And so what this declaration proposes to do is add a vehicle on top of these wheels, a framework on top of this wheel, of all these wheels, to combine the energy, the capacity, and create a sort of generated, coordinated, driven sense of purpose to all of these agendas that already exist that are driving into the future. And so, thinking of future generations and the well-being of future generations as a global public good provides that sort of overarching framework, the vehicle, so to speak, to drive these existing wheels down the road to the future. And so it's not about reinventing the wheel, but rather coordinating those agendas that already exist. And I think that, as a team, is the added value we see in proposing the well-being of future generations as a global public good, and really driving this declaration forward. So that's sort of my thought with regards to the Declaration on Future Generations. And we hope that you'll read the report and you'll see some of the thoughts that we've brought out in that. And it's a similar thing that we've done with the Global Digital Compact, with the new Agenda for Peace. Is not been reinventing the wheel, so to speak, but taking what's already out there and saying, well, here's how we can rejuvenate, revitalize, and cross-fertilize and coordinate. But Richard, any thoughts?
Sure, yeah, and I'd like to weave in a final question that I saw from the YouTube chat into my response, and it's from a longtime friend, a mentor of mine, Douglas Roach in Canada, the founder and chairman emeritus of the Middle Powers Initiative, and he writes, how can we ensure that the Secretary General's new Agenda for Peace will include the negotiated elimination of nuclear weapons as a key component? And I already outlined how important it is that we all engage this process, civil society writ large, working with our partners in governments. And we keep emphasizing it literally is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The last time, as Brian Finley noted at the outset of our program, was in 2005. And I bet with renewal of the 2030 agenda in 2030, the next time we're going to get this chance will be in 2 more decades, the centenary of the UN. But we don't do these changes simply because of an important anniversary, although we never let an important anniversary go to waste. But it's the issues that the UN is grappling with. To be honest, I've been working on this as a student in the 90s, as I referred to, and we thought the post-Cold War era, the 50th anniversary of the UN would be the moment, 1995. Not much happened. It wasn't until 2005, as we've cited a few examples, but those were still important steps, but not where we need to be, especially when you consider, and I'm going to come back to the nuclear question that was raised by Douglas Roach, but the pandemic of the last 2.5 years. What more of a global challenge that we need, that we've experienced, and you can't solve it in your part of the world unless it's being solved globally. The quintessential challenge of our time, climate change, all the different facets, and restructuring our economies. And I know the high-level advisory board is going into great detail on those questions, but who would have thought in our lifetime, especially those who were born after the Cold War, several of which are on today's panel, that we're talking about the specter of a thermonuclear exchange? We heard it at the outbreak of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in late February, and we heard it again last week. Threats are being lodged of a nature I've not seen and we thought about in the 1980s as a kid, and worrying about an exchange between Eastern and Western blocs. So Douglas Roach is absolutely right. The new Agenda for Peace has to be a clarion call on this critical issue. We still have these awesome, destructive, powerful weapons. There is an international campaign to ban landmines that succeeded in getting a very important treaty to be signed by the majority of the world states. But unfortunately, the nuclear powers not only are not playing ball with that commitment within their own non-proliferation treaty to abolish nukes over time, that's in the last part of that treaty from during the Cold War. But secondly, we just had an NPT review a few weeks ago in August, and it led to an inconclusive result at a most critical time. So it's absolutely critical that these next 2 years we take full advantage and use these instruments, starting with a framework like the new Agenda for Peace, to put all major consequential peace and security issues on the agenda, but then look at the connections, because the future of conflict, as we've noted, climate change, resource wars, water. This is what's going to be driving migration, driving conflict in the future. This is why it's critical that we work across a whole range of issues, the pillars of the UN, peace and security, sustainable development, human rights, and I would even argue climate needs to be seen as its pillar in its own right going forward. So thank you once again, and we're really thankful to Miriam for a phenomenal job moderating today's discussion. Oh, she might be waiting for any other concluding thoughts.
Oh, I can conclude in a very short. With our future summit report that High-Level Advisory Board is preparing, and the declarations of Future Generation New Agenda for Peace and Global Digital Compact, I also sincerely hope that the challenges of young generation of today can be solved, and not only that, the challenges, the problems of young generation that is yet to be born can also be solved with all those that we are doing today. And yeah, I'm really optimistic on it. Thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. Well, actually, I'm really glad that we had that final comment from you, Poonam, because speaking about a new Cold War, perhaps a sort of renewed global conflict that could be more dangerous and less predictable than what we've seen in the past would be a very dull and depressing note to conclude this discussion on. But nonetheless, thank you very much. I do appreciate all of you. Of course, we had those opening remarks from Excellency Lola Al-Khater and Brian Finlay. Also, thanks very much to Richard, Michael, Muzna, Nodara and Poonam. And thank you to everyone who sent through your questions. Really do appreciate your contribution. I hope we can come together again and be able to talk like this and perhaps have more discussions to sort of build on this report and how it could be an effective tool and a great platform for inspiring and motivating action on, gosh, so many issues. I don't think it could be more relevant than it is at this time, but thank you very much again. And I hope we can meet not too long from now.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Yes.